clearly, Ellie, you can hear me. I mean, it may be other people's audio. Okay. Well, first of all, welcome to the training. And first of all, we will be covering within the training the principles of public life, the code and why we have one. Still getting asked this. When the code applies, the general obligations, interests, including disclosable pecuniary interests and non-registerable interests, and trying to sort of demystify a bit between the two, predetermination, and the future of ethical standards. Next slide, please. Still get asked why we have a code. I think there's new councillors joined and they sort of try to understand why they are suddenly bound by something that they may not have even been aware of before the election. Well, pre-2011, it was a statutory code and it was set out that all councils had to abide by the same code of conduct across England. Now, in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, there is still this same statutory code. It's nearly identical to the code in Cornwall, which I'll discuss a little bit as we go forward, and that's of benefit to everybody in Cornwall because there's a lot of case law around this and you can help interpret the code as well. But in England in 2011 things changed and the Localism Act set out that it was to be a duty for an authority to promote and maintain high standards of conduct. It made it a statutory duty for your council to do this. In discharging this duty, the Act said that you must adopt a code of conduct. Now, it didn't say a lot about what should be in the code, but it did say that it should be consistent with the 7 principles of public life. That was selflessness, honesty, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, and leadership. At the time this was brought in, the Standards Committee at Cornwall Council discussed this with CALC, and there were previously, as some of you may be aware, 10 principles of public life. So it was decided to include as a preamble to the code that the code should also reflect personal judgment, respect for others, the duty to uphold the law and stewardship. And these are included within the Cornish Code. And this is what the code is based on. The principles of public life do not form part of the code, but they do form the preamble to it and is how the code is based. Next slide, please. The code obviously applies to you as an elected member. I've lost the slides, Ellie. Ellie, the slides have gone.
Sorry, Simon, someone's taken over control. Bear with me 2 seconds.
Can people not control, and can people please switch their video cameras off? It makes it much easier to deal with people's broadband. Thank you. The code applies.
Sorry. Okay.
The code logically applies to you when you're acting as a member. Pre-2006, it was considered that the code applied to everybody all the time. If you were elected as a councillor, the code applied to you. However, at this time, Mayor Livingston, as he was then, went to a birthday party in London and came out of the birthday party and called a reporter a Nazi. He was reported for a breach of the code of conduct, and his standards committee suspended him for 3 months. He appealed this, and the basis for his appeal was that even though he was in the nightclub, even though he admitted the act of calling the reporter a Nazi, his argument was that he was there in his private capacity. He was attending a private birthday party. There was no mayoral staff, no mayoral car, nothing like that at all. And the courts agreed with him. They said, no, you were there in your private capacity and you were not bound by the code. The law changed around then, and some of your members will remember that. And currently, it sets out that the code applies to you when you conduct the business of your authority, which includes the business of the office to which you are elected or appointed, or you act, claim to act, or give the impression you are acting as a representative of your authority. Now, with regards to the latter, that is, you give the impression you are acting as a representative of your authority, you need to carefully consider your actions away from the chamber and away from casework. For instance, on social media, the advice that I would always provide is, if you have a single account for you as a member of your authority, and you also mix in with that your private life, I would look at separating out the two. If you have a councillor account, that is what would be bound by the code. If you then have a private account and you never put anything to do with council business on that private account, it is just there for private matters, family matters, friends matters, and you never give the impression you are acting as a representative of your authority on it, that would not be bound by the code. A lot of breaches arise from people mixing their private and personal lives. And the reason for saying make sure you try to separate the two out is you can be off duty. You can act as an individual. You can make planning applications. You can lobby your council as a private individual. But you must ensure you always do it as any other individual in the county would do, and not using the access that being a councillor grants you. Next slide, please. A couple of examples for you to show when somebody may or may not be acting in their official capacity. First of all, a councillor had several altercations in the town over a couple of days. It was due to a personal matter. Councillor had altercations, but never once did he use his official capacity. We spoke to the people that were involved, the complainants who came forward, and they said, no, they never said he was a councillor, but I know he's a councillor. The police were involved with one of them. They said, no, he never once raised the fact he was a councillor. He did say it was a private matter and they were dealing with it. Because he never invoked his official capacity, he never gave the impression he was acting in his official capacity, so therefore there was no breach of the code. The code did not apply to his actions. Unlike the next matter, which is a councillor attended a local pub after a council meeting. They'd had a particularly controversial planning application, and the local applicant was also a controversial character locally. They carried on discussing the planning application in the pub. It was various issues they were considering, and one of the councillors raised the issue of the applicant. He did so in less than complimentary terms. Several complaints were made about what was said in the pub, and it was considered that the councillor was carrying on to give the impression they were acting in their official capacity. And the reason was they were still discussing how they should deal with the planning application, whether they should go and do a site visit, whether they should look at it further. And there was a breach of the code found in that instance. Had they just discussed the planning application itself, that is unlikely there would have been a breach of the code. And I'll cover why in a moment. Next slide, please. You may remember a couple of slides ago, we said the code has to set out how you will deal with the conduct of members. And one of the things that was in the previous statutory code and is in the codes in the other parts of the United Kingdom are things called general obligations. These have changed a little bit since 2002, but not much. Generally, there is a lot of case law behind these. There's a lot of tribunal decisions behind these. So it's quite easy now to interpret them and then to pass on to members exactly what it means by treating with respect or disclosing confidential information. And for treating others with respect, That is, you must not be unduly personal in the comments that you make to other people, whether they're members or whether they are members of the public. You can challenge and be critical, and that is part of the role of a member, is to challenge and be critical. But you must not be personal about it. Going back to our councillor, who we just mentioned, the pub, challenging the planning application and being critical about it was part of the role of the member. And often you will see members will challenge all sorts of things at different meetings, and they're quite within their rights. The reason that the councillor stepped over the line was that his comments were then personal about the applicant, and they were then found to be disrespectful. This is the most popular complaint we get, is that people have been treated with disrespect, or they've not been treated with respect. Nearly 50% of the complaints we receive have respect or disrespect mentioned in them at some point. We think it's because what different generations may find respectful or disrespectful, other generations don't. But my advice to try and to avoid the complaints is to make sure you are critical of the thing, but not the person. The next one is you must not unlawfully discriminate. It's fairly self-explanatory. Against any of the protected characteristics. We very, very rarely have a complaint of discrimination upheld in England. Occasionally, in Cornwall, occasionally it does arise, and it does arise in England, but it's not a common complaint that's upheld. A lot of disrespect, and a lot of the next one, which is bullying and harassing people, but overall, not a lot of discrimination. I had a question in the chat saying, can councillors challenge in emails and at public meetings? And is it okay for just between councillors, or should every member of the council have been involved? There's no need, if you wish to challenge somebody else, for you to involve other members of the council. You can challenge in emails, you can challenge by letter, but the same rules apply if you are acting in your official capacity. However you are undertaking the challenge, it must be done with respect. Moving on to bullying, harassing, ACAS guides are very good on this. Harass is a new provision that has been added to the Code of Conduct by the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Cornwall Council has updated their code. They did it in March, and the recommendation to the towns and parishes is to adopt this because it is a recommendation from the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Occasionally we do get harassment, and it's more of that badgering rather than the bullying. There is guides online at the ACAS site, and there will be guidance coming out on this. I know some towns and parishes have already adopted this, and some are going to. If any of the clerks before adoption wish to discuss this, please let me know. Be happy to assist. The next one is you must not intimidate others. Slightly different to bullying, and I can give you an example of a council where a councillor was adamant that the clerk should take matters arising. This had happened multiple times in the past, but this time the clerk stood her ground. The member was not having this. She was not happy with it at all. She threw her papers in the clerk's face, went up to her, right up to her nose, and screamed at her, left the room, came back in, kicked chairs over, screamed at the clerk again that she was to do as she was told, and then left the room. It was found that she was trying to intimidate the clerk into her point of view, and there was a breach of the code found. The member was censured. The next provision, you must not conduct yourself in a manner that is contrary to the council's duty to promote and maintain high standards of conduct, is in there because that is what it says in the Localism Act. It places this obligation on your council to do this, and that obligation is then placed upon you as individual members. Generally, if you are found to have breached the code, you will then found to have breached this provision as well. There are some differences with the codes in Cornwall, and one of the main differences is the Gifts and Hospitality Register. The recommendation from the Committee on Standards in Public Life is that it's a gift of £50 or £100 in any 1 year. Some codes of conduct in Cornwall for the parishes have only £10 threshold for registering. Some have 25, some have 30, some have 20. You will need to check your own code of conduct as to what the threshold is for registering a gift or hospitality. If you do get given a gift and it is a particularly nice gift and it breaches your threshold, then you will need to ensure that it is registered with your clerk, or if you're a Cornwall councillor, with your monitoring officer. If you do get a gift, this can create an interest with that person, but by registering the gift, it then makes it nice and clear and it's out in the open that you've been given this. The next one is you must not compromise the impartiality of those who work for or on behalf of the council. The reason this is in the code is that as members, you all have unique access to your own officers and the officers at Cornwall Council. Because of this, you should not compromise their impartiality. They must be left to do their work as officers would, and all the other provisions above, must treat others with respect, etc., apply as well as this. If you have anything before your council or before another council and you wish to engage with an officer over it, you should engage with them as a member of the public would, and you must not engage with them through your official channels. And the final slide on this page is you must not disclose information given in confidence. You will get a lot of information given to you. You get information from your council and you will get information that arises from casework. In all cases, it is given to you in confidence, then you must ensure that confidence is maintained. There is a public interest test that applies to this, but my advice is not to assume that if you wish to disclose something, the public interest test is satisfied. A member was privy to the tenders that his parish council had received for grass cutting in the area. He did not agree with the tenders or the contract amount. So immediately after the tenders had been considered and the council had voted to award the contract, he went home and posted on social media the different amounts and who had awarded it and why he disagreed. That was clearly a breach of confidence, not only through the code, and it was probably a common law breach of confidence as well. It resulted in the member being censured. It would have previously probably resulted in a suspension. And because of this, the parish council then had to rerun the tendering process. I had another question on the chat. Are officers obliged to follow these rules? The officers have an officer code of conduct. Certainly in Cornwall Council they do. If officers of towns and parishes should have a code of conduct, an employee code of conduct, and if members consider themselves bullied by officers, then they should make a complaint to the manager of that officer, and that should go through the complaints process internally. There was talk of applying this general code to officers in 2008, but it was blocked by the unions. Next slide, please. The next one is you must not prevent someone from gaining access to information. Generally, we get a lot of complaints about this because people make freedom of information requests to parish councils. The parish councils nearly always deal with them very well, but there are exemptions which can be applied to information, and because of that, somebody might not get the information they requested. As a result, they then complain that they've been prevented from accessing the information by a councillor or several councillors. The code is not there to consider whether the exemptions have been applied correctly to a freedom of information request. That is the job of the Information Commissioner. The code will consider if there is proof that a councillor has blocked access to information or has blocked it through the information request process. So therefore, if we get a complaint saying Councillor X has prevented me from accessing the information because these exemptions have been applied, our response will be to reject the complaint and refer the request to the ICO. The following provision is you must not do anything that could be reasonably regarded as bringing your office or authority into disrepute. Normally, it is something that if you're standing within the community would be damaged by your actions, and it is normal for your office, if you breach the code, to you to bring your office into disrepute. Authority is a much higher threshold. I've known it once at a hearing where a member in Cornwall was disqualified from holding public office for 2 years. But it is a much, much higher threshold and generally arises through the actions of the member and the inactions of the council. You must not use your position improperly to gain or cause an advantage or disadvantage. As I've mentioned, and as I'll mention going forwards, you have unique access to officers. You have unique access to those within your council and other councils, and you must not use this position improperly. You must not vote on a matter if you have an interest, as it can be considered that you have caused an advantage or a disadvantage by voting in a particular way. This again is something that does come up a lot within the complaints we get. It's not found as often as you would think, but and is more likely to be tied with interests than anything else. The next provision is you must not use the resources of the council improperly. This is self-explanatory. You have resources within your council for everything from paper to photocopiers. If you have laptops, an email system, and it should be used for council business and not personal business. If you use the resources of your council for personal business, this could be considered to be using the resources of the council improperly. I'll take the next two together. You must have regard to the advice given, and you must give reasons for the decisions. You must have regard to the advice, but you do not have to follow it. It is your choice as to whether you follow that advice. And same as giving reasons for decision, unless you are required to give a decision, reasons for a decision in law, you do not have to give a reason. Those of you that have sat in front of the local government ombudsman will know that they will often ask members, why did you vote a particular way? Now they have a statutory power to ask that. If a member of the public asks it and you don't want to answer, you don't have to. You don't have to follow the advice, and we get lots of complaints, particularly on planning matters, to say that the members did not vote as was required by the planning officers. And when I asked them why they voted, they wouldn't tell me. You don't have to. You can vote for, against, or abstain on any matter if you wish. Next provision covers scrutinising decisions, and this is primarily for Cornwall Council, but the reason it is within the code of conduct that is being passed out to the towns and parishes is that some towns do run a pseudo scrutiny function. And it's very important that there is this separation between a previous decision that you may have been involved with and then the scrutinising of it. And the recommendation is you should not take part in scrutinising the decision you've been involved with. And the next two are new and have come about due to recommendations from the Committee on Standards in Public Life. The first is you must assist with any assessment or investigation of a breach of the Code of Conduct. I have to say, we've discussed this at the Monitoring Officers Roundtable, and councillors in Cornwall, with the odd exception, always engage with assessments or investigation. And we will get a lot of complaints in, and the complaints that will go forwards. And when the councillor engages, a lot of decisions are opposite to what the complainant would like because of the way that the council is engaged. And I would encourage you, if a breach of the code is made, please ensure that you engage fully as part of the investigation. Paul Simmons has asked, does being part of a personal action to protest in public bring your office into disrepute if you are arrested? If you are there in your official capacity, yes. If you're there in your private capacity, no. The final provision is you must undertake training, and the full wording is every 4 years or as recommended by your monitoring officer. And there is an additional provision for every 2 years for those councils that wish to include it. Though it is accepted that it may be difficult for the clerks to track which members are undertaking the training and when. We do note who is in attendance at the training such as this, but we're still trying to work on how we track those who access the recordings of the training. Before we move on to the next bit of the training, has anybody got any questions on the general obligations, please? Okay, next slide, please, Ellie. Looking at some complaints that have been in the press over the last couple of years, there's still breaches of the code found across the United Kingdom, and I've tried to pick out a few that may be relevant and informative. The first one is councillor made disrespectful comments in an online meeting. There was an online meeting of the council, and it was to consider the salary of the leader. A councillor made allegations about the leader's conduct. Now, this was a wide-ranging meeting. There was a lot of people in attendance at it. The council was warned at the meeting it was not the correct forum to raise these things. There was a fixed process to go through the complaints process, and the leader wasn't there to even counter these. So therefore, he must desist. The member continued, and he was then removed from the meeting. Now, this happens a lot more in virtual meetings. It's a touch of a button, and the member was removed. However, he was incorrect in the way he approached this. He was then found to have failed to treat others with respect, brought his office into disrepute, and he was considered to have used his position to gain an advantage. There was elections. This was in January. There was elections later in the year, and he was raising allegations to try, it was felt, to deliberately smear the leader at the time without following the correct procedures. Because of this, this council was censured. Next slide, please. I said we don't have many breaches of discrimination in Cornwall, but this one was a large council. I think it was in the Leicestershire area. A councillor was part of an interview panel for a senior officer. Does happen in the big councils quite often. It was a mixed panel. They made comments about the ability of a candidate, first of all, to undertake the role that they were applying for as a mother of two, and then they made comments about the use of Hebrew by local residents. Several members of the panel and the candidate themselves complained about the conduct of the member, and it was found to have breached the code and was required to undertake equality and diversity training. So we don't get many of these in Cornwall, but that was an example I did find online. Next slide, please. And perhaps an example of when messages may not be as private as you thought. This complaint is still ongoing, but I picked it out of the press releases. It was a WhatsApp message group used within a political group. Lots of these groups exist. This was a political one. Councillor A made comments about Councillor B, and then Councillor A fell out with a political group, and because of this, they left a WhatsApp group. The message that Councillor A had put on WhatsApp was then leaked to Councillor B. Councillor B considers that the comments were disrespectful and brought a complaint under the code. Now, this raises wider issues about the confidentiality of the WhatsApp group, whether the message should have been leaked or not in the first place. And also, it was perhaps an advice is be careful what you put in writing. This could be something that could be found to disrespectful as well as the fact that it shouldn't have been leaked in the first place. Next slide, please. And I've included this because of the last bullet point, because it brings up a whole range of questions. Members all across Cornwall, I know, from various levels have had guidance on undertaking virtual meetings, even though we're now returning to face-to-face. In Teesside, councillors advised that they should not eat, drink, vape, drive, and why they felt the need to include this last provision is not sure, because they've said that you should not operate heavy machinery. I tried to find out if somebody was operating heavy machinery during the meeting, but I couldn't. Does anybody have any final questions on that first part of the training, please? Councillor Cormack. You have to unmute yourself to ask a question.
Sorry, just getting used to the controls.
Yes.
I missed something about what you said about the unions. One of the changes was going ahead and the unions blocked in 2008. I missed that point.
It was the at the time they were looking at introducing a national code of conduct for employees in the same way there is for councillors.
Right.
There was a full consultation done on it. I was a monitoring officer at Penwith at the time. But in the end, the unions blocked it, and then they had the general election, and it just went by the wayside then.
Okay, thank you. And one very small thing at the beginning of your introduction, I'm afraid distracted by someone trying to get me on the phone. Something about, you said we're lucky in Cornwall. Is that because we haven't got the full statutory?
Oh no, I think we're very lucky with the members and the conduct.
Okay, right. Okay, that's fine. Thank you. That's what but England, I take it, is no longer statutory from what you're saying.
It's got to be made by each individual council.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. That's clear now. Thank you.
See, Councillor Burden's put in the chat, for those that don't see it, we have a councillor who shops or rides his bike at virtual meetings. Yes, that doesn't surprise me. Moving on now to conflicts of interest. Next slide, please. It said in the Localism Act, I said it didn't say much about what should be in a code, but it did set out that you should have disclosable pecuniary interests and interests other than disclosable pecuniary interests, though it did not say what these other interests should be. It did, in the 2012 regulations, tell us what a disclosable pecuniary interest was. And these were set out in the regulations as employment. That is anything that is carried out for profit or gain. So any employment you have, even if it's part-time, even if it's just at weekends, if you're self-employed, you should put down what you're self-employed as. This is something you carry out for profit or gain. If you are a director of a company and you receive remuneration, or what they term enhanced expenses, that is profit or gain. If, as a lot of councillors do, you act as a trustee for a local village hall, for instance, or you're on a community interest company, or you're a member of a local group or body as a volunteer, that is not profit or gain, and that does not need to be on your register of interest form. It can create a non-registerable interest. I'll come on to that in a moment, but it is not something that needs to be registered. Only if you make money in some form from the thing is that classed as employment. The next one is sponsorship, and that is anybody who sponsors, who paid your election expenses. Normally a political party, but I have known businesses in the past to sponsor individual members. It doesn't happen as much these days, but it used to. Contracts is any contract between you and the body in which you have a beneficial interest and your local authority. So if you or Bloggs Grass Cutting Inc., which you're a partner in, has a contract for grass cutting with your council, that should go down on your register of interest form. If the contract is with another council, it does not need to go on your register of interest form. Land. It's defined as any land within the area of your authority. So if you're a parish councillor and you work within your parish but do not live in your parish, you do not need to register your property. It's only if the land is within the area of your local authority. And my advice is to make sure there is sufficient on the register of interest form to allow the land to be identified. You don't have to put grid references, etc. But if it's agricultural land, there should be enough of a description to be identified. 99% of councillors do a very good job with this, and I've managed to find all of them bar a few online. Michelle, can I deal with your question outside of the forum, because it's personal, and I'll come on to that. But it doesn't. If you're not a Cornwall councillor, then no, because unless you if you're not a Cornwall councillor and you're doing work for them, then no. But perhaps you could take this up outside of the training. Licenses is any license with your authority. If you're a parish councillor, sorry, everybody, if you've seen in the chat, Michelle has asked if she has to fill as she's just had to fill in a CC supplier form as offering consultancy work. That does not need to go down. She's a parish councillor, so therefore it is not something, a contract with her authority. Going back to the registrable interest, licenses, is a license with your authority, a license to graze, a license to occupy, a mooring licenses, alcohol licenses. These have all come up in the past and all go on the register of interest form. Allotment licenses, if it's a license with your authority, it needs to go down. Same as corporate tenancies. It's a tenancy between you and the body in which you have a beneficial interest and your authority. So if we take our grass cutting example, if you have Bloggs Grass Cutting, store your grass cutting machinery in a building and you lease it from your council, then you need to put that down on your register of interest form. And the final one is securities, and this is shares to the value of over £25,000 in a body which has offices in your area. Now, those of you that have a share portfolio, as I know some members do, because the shares are moved around, you do not need to put that down on under securities, because you do not know at any one point where the money in the shares is. Question, would I need to declare a charity I run, as I have in the past received donations from the parish council? Not as a charity. You would not need to declare it unless you take any money from the charity in terms of remuneration. However, in the next part, this is where you would need to require to declare it. Next slide, please. We've covered disclosable pecuniary interests, and the code also has to have interests that are non-registerable. And that is, what is under discussion has the potential to affect the well-being or financial position of. Now, financial position is quite clear. Well-being is described as general contentment or happiness. Now, it's difficult to quantify, and the only example I've heard of it where it's been used was in a tribunal hearing where a councillor had not declared an interest, despite the fact she lived in a cul-de-sac surrounded by agricultural land, and there was a plan to build 12 properties in front of her property. There would be a new road past her property, there would be houses built, and all this disruption. The judge at the tribunal said that, in my view, the general contentment and happiness of that member would be disturbed, as well as their financial position. So therefore, she should have declared an interest. When you have to declare an interest is if it concerns a family member. Now, in looking at that, lots of people have extended families, and you will need to use your personal judgment about how far into that extended family you consider that an interest may arise. In terms of this, if you regularly interact with your extended family, then all the family would create an interest. If you never see any of your extended family from one year to another, it's unlikely that you would create an interest. And with all of these things, and starting with a family member, think about the proximity to that thing or person or group or body. The closer you are to that thing, person or group or body, then the more likely it is you have an interest that would need declaring. That goes to the close associate. Parish councillors, you know lots of people in your parishes. They have people you know and you've probably known for years, but you may not have a close association with these people. It is generally considered the more you interact socially with somebody, the more you spend time with them, and it has been found to regular list sharing with other people's children, doing it, going to clubs, going to schools, etc., does create a close association. The more likely close association exists. Business dealings on a regular basis will create a close association. An occasional business dealing will only create close association for a period of time that you're doing the transaction and then shortly after. It does not create close association for a long period of time. Councillor Crawley, you have a question.
Yeah, I'm a parish councillor, and I'm also involved in a number of other sort of activities in the area, some of which are, I mean, for example, the parish hall, the PCC, and one or two other sort of social bodies. The trouble is that in a rural environment, very often, you know, one might feel that because you're part of these bodies, and these bodies are often coming up in discussion, you know, are you in a position? What's the position then? Because, you know, I would have to keep quiet in the vast majority of meetings because of my other interests.
I can actually help answer this as we go through this, Councillor Crawley, because the rest of the provisions do give you some satisfaction and should assist you is when you to declare an interest. If it doesn't, by the time we get to the end of it, come back to me.
Okay, thanks.
And Councillor Brown says, redeclaring property ownership within your authority. If you are a parish councillor, does this apply only to the parish or to the whole area represented by your county councillor? It is the area of your authority. So it is the area of your parish that you have to declare the property ownership in, not if there's a wider ward covered by the Cornwall councillor. Next one is a body or group of which you are a member. Now, just got asked about being a member of running a charity. The councillor is a member of that charity, so they are a member of a body or group. You have to be a member of that body or group. There is a case, though, from Scotland, which I'll mention in a minute, which the person wasn't a full member, and it's quite interesting about the way they viewed that. Then it goes on to say it is something that more than it might affect the majority of inhabitants of the area. So if it is something quite important to the area, then it is not something you would need to declare an interest in. For example, when they were going to close West Cornwall Hospital, clearly that would affect everybody in the West of Cornwall, Penzance, surrounding areas, even out to Hale and St Ives. It was asked then, do local councillors who have an interest through the health service have to declare interest? And the answer was no. because the closure of West Cornwall Hospital would have affected the majority of inhabitants in the area. And the next one, which goes back to the question we got asked about being involved with different things. The fact that a member may be involved with different things, and these things may get raised in discussions at council, does not necessarily mean that an interest is created. It has to be something that a reasonable person with knowledge of the relevant facts would view as so significant that it could be perceived as affecting your judgment. Now, clearly, this is very much on a case-by-case basis as to whether you should have to declare an interest or not. But a lot of small things within the parish, and just generally a group or body being involved, does not create a declarable interest. For instance, if you are a trustee on the local hall and there is an annual report going forward to council which is to be presented and then noted, and that is the only decision that is planned, then there would be no need for you to declare an interest. Just listening to the annual report and then noting it would not create an interest. If the report was coming forwards from the trust and there was a request, say, for £10,000 grant to be made to the trust, then that is something that a member of the public may consider would be significant, that it could affect your judgment, and you then should declare a non-registerable interest as a member of that group or body. Does anybody have any questions on non-registerable and disclosable pecuniary interest, please? Okay, next slide, please. Code of conduct says you have to declare and leave, and paragraph 3.5 sets this out. And next bullet points, what this says is, if you have a disclosable pecuniary interest or a non-registerable interest, you should declare it and leave. So therefore, if the matter under discussion will affect your land, you should declare and leave. If it affects your employment, you should declare and leave. If it affects your brothers, mothers, fathers, sisters, cousins, close cousins, interests in employment or any of the above, you should declare and leave. You should declare the interest at the start of the meeting, but if you're not aware of it, you should declare the interest as soon as you become aware of it. I've seen members in planning committee, somebody's got up to speak at strategic planning and they have gone, Mr. Chairman, I know that person, I need to declare an interest, and they've left the meeting. That is the right thing to do. Do not stay in the room if you think an interest has been created by somebody that may be included with that application and you weren't aware of them. Next slide, please. I mentioned about being a group member of a group or body, and this is a case from Scotland from June 2019. I've left this in. It's slightly older than some of the other ones, but the reason I've left it in is because it took quite an interesting look at being a member of a group or body. This Fife Council was a member of Scotland Against Spin. They were the member of its social media. They were the administrator of its social media page. They were the only administrator for the social media page. They had complete control over the public message that Scotland Against Spin was sending out. They could monitor all comments that were made on the social media page, and they could edit them accordingly. And in fact, they had more control over Scotland Against Spin in the way it was forward facing than anybody else within the group or body, the chairman, any of the committee members or any of the ordinary members. They've had far more control. The planning committee on which the Fife councillors sat then considered the turbine application, and the councillor proposed rejecting it. The councillor's argument was that they were not a member of the group or body, so therefore should not have to declare an interest. The hearing looked at this and looked at whether they were still a member of a group or body by being in control of the social media as they were. And they concluded that they were. They had not severed their ties with the group or body. And as I've said, they actually had more control over some of it than any other member. So as a result, this member was suspended for 2 months. They still have suspensions in Scotland. Next slide, please. This is the councillor here was not a decision maker, but they pressurised fellow members to supporting a housing plan. The scheme, and it favoured his son.
Lost you, Simon.
I'm back. I apologise. Some reason it kicked me out. I hope you can hear me. The pressured members to support a scheme which favoured his son and the developer. And in terms of the developer, they stayed at the developer's villa in Barbados 3 times and attended private parties with the developer. It's interesting. I've read this. The councillor said that, well, it wasn't a free holiday. I have to pay for my own flights to Barbados. Well, he still stayed at the villa free of charge, and it was owned by the developer. As I said, he was not a decision maker in this, but it was considered that the councillor used his position to gain an advantage, and his actions brought the council into disrepute. The council in this case was censured. I've got no doubt if suspensions were back in Cornwall, the councillor would have been suspended. Next slide, please. This is a Northern Ireland one, and they still have suspensions in Northern Ireland. The council have substantial financial interest in property. They had a lot of property within Belfast, several million. At the first meeting, the councillor correctly declared an interest. They said they had an interest, declared it, they left the meeting. But prior to the meeting, at a group meeting, they asked another councillor to raise issues about the property that they owned. And it was seen as a deliberate attempt to circumvent the rules on interest. The member had an agent. The agent could have brought these representations before the council, but they chose not to do so. They chose to go through these channels. Next slide, please. 2 weeks later, the councillor failed to declare an interest at full council on the same matter. No idea why. It was exactly the same matter. Went back before council, failed to declare an interest. The motion they were considering would have significant benefit to the property. It was related to car parking. The hearing noted the previous good conduct of the councillor, but it noted the deliberate failure to declare an interest and to try to use the position to influence matters. This council was suspended for 3 months. And in terms of the Councillor Davis has asked, what is the difference between censure and suspension? A censure is when you are basically, it's a report from council to say they disapprove of your actions. A suspension is you are suspended from acting as a councillor without allowances for a period of, in this case, 3 months. It used to be, and is potentially coming back, that standards committees could suspend members in England for up to 6 months. During that time, you are not a councillor. You are completely removed from being a councillor. And Councillor Brond has asked, if I have a personal application, can I speak in a public forum of a parish council meeting? And the answer is no. The reason is that, first of all, the law is you have to remove yourself from the group, from the meeting, if you have an interest. And the rules on bias as well prevent you from being in the meeting. The rules on bias go back a lot longer than the code. Another question from Councillor Simmons. When it comes to planning, what is the guideline of knowing the applicants sufficient to register an interest and have to leave? As I said, Councillor Simmons earlier, think about your proximity to that person. Parish councillors generally know nearly everybody in their parish. if you regularly interact with them socially, if you go into their houses for teas and coffees, you exchange birthday cards, lift share with the children, socialize with them, well, socializing is allowed, then you are more likely than not to have a close association. Just knowing them, saying hello to them in the pub or the shop or etc. does not create close association. Next slide, please. The next bit is predetermination. Now, this is not part of the code of conduct, but I've included it within the training because we get so many questions about it, and also so many complaints arise that people say the council has breached the code because they've said this. In looking at predetermination, next slide, please. If you have a general opinion on something, this is legalized under section 25(2) of the Localism Act and through case law. Is generally known as predisposition. If you say, I generally think this thing over there is a good idea, or I don't think this thing is a good idea, you are generally predisposed to a point of view. If you adopt the closed mind, that is predetermination. So therefore, if you say adopt the over my dead body approach with regards to a thing that is coming before you, then you are considered to be predetermined. And a question from Councillor Brown: would rule of bias apply if a planning application has implications for a heritage site, or AOMB if you are a member of a charity or professional group that is involved with a conservation? Yes, quite possibly, but it would not be bias. It's more likely to be that a non-registerable interest would arise if you are a member of a group or body, or particularly a professional group that is involved with the conservation. Next slide, please. Predetermination. The Enfield case looked at a local planning matter. For bias and predetermination, this case said you must look beyond interests to consider if a fair-minded and informed observer viewed the decision maker of having a closed mind or being biased. Now, the reason this sits outside the code is that sometimes members may not have an interest in the matter. They may not be a member of a group or body that's involved with it. It may not include a family member. But as a councillor in St Ives in West Cornwall he was so outspoken about a particular matter, it was clear he was predetermined. And in this case, this councillor had a closed mind, and he knew he had a closed mind. It was what he had done prior to the meeting that showed he had a closed mind. And it is always the key point. But the Enfield case raised an interesting point, and there's another case towards the end I'll raise with this as well. It said when considering it must be done in a way that would not make local government decision making impossible or unduly difficult. And what this is as councils, you will often make decisions or be involved with things. Local neighbourhood plans are a very good example. It's a question I get asked a lot about neighbourhood plans. If we agree this as councillors, are we then predetermined? No, you're not. You are looking at planning within your area, as councils have with different plans, etc., and policies in the past. Generally, agreeing a policy or a scheme for your area does not predetermine you from making a decision on a matter. The reason is you are looking at the area as a whole when you're developing policies or plans. A particular scheme, you consider the merits of that individual scheme itself, and it might be inside the area that was for development, it might be outside of it. It doesn't make any difference. You should consider the scheme on its individual merits. But even if it's in or out of your areas, you are not considered to be predetermined. You may be predisposed to looking at development in a certain area, but you're not considered to be predetermined. Next slide, please. I've included this one because there's a lot of more consultations going on these days. And this has been raised, the neighbourhood plan consultations as well. And I found this online, and it was an interesting decision about the looking at the third runway for Heathrow, and it related to just the consultation that was undertaken for the third runway and whether it had been approached with an open mind. Now, the challenge was brought by local residents and by Gatwick Airport. Their view was that the government had expressed a preference towards the third runway at Heathrow, and therefore they had approached the consultation with a closed mind. The government had said, yes, this is what we think is a good idea. The court looked at this and they considered that the views of the government had been prior views, but were not predetermination. And there was nothing that they had been presented with that show that the consultations had not been approached with an open mind. So there was no predetermination, and the outcome of the consultation was found to be sound. Next slide, please. Persimmon Homes, similar to the one we've had earlier. Council granted planning permission, and it was granted on the grounds of predetermination because of the involvement of local plans. The judgment made it clear there must be a distinction between prior views, which resulted in predisposition, and a closed mind, which is predetermination. The facts of this were the decision makers were not found to have a closed mind, so therefore there was no predetermination on the part of the members. Next slide, please. Does anybody have any questions, please, on predetermination or predisposition? Okay, last bit, the future. What's next for ethical standards? Well, it's always been changing ethical standards ever since it first came out in 2002. There's been changes through the years, new codes, new guidance, big change in 2011. Then the Committee on Standards in Public Life did a very thorough review throughout 2018 into ethical standards in local government. We set up several roundtable meetings with monitoring officers, town and parish councillors, local councillors to find out what they wanted, what they felt was wrong with the code. They came to Cornwall. We were one of only 5 councils that were visited by the committee. They met with town and parish councillors, they met with Cornwall councillors, officers at Cornwall Council, CALC, and with member of the Society of Local Council Clerks. The outcome of this was that the review into ethical standards was published on the 30th of January 2019. The review contained 26 recommendations and 15 examples of best practice. Of those, a large majority were already within the Code of Conduct in Cornwall or within the procedures that Cornwall Council uses to consider ethical standards complaints. So we're already well ahead of the curve. But some of the recommendations require changes to statute before they could be introduced. And we're still waiting for that. Next slide, please. As part of this process of re-looking at ethical standards, a new model code was produced by the Local Government Association. This was looked at by the Standards Committee in Cornwall Council, but it was found better to adopt some of the changes that were recommended by the Committee on Standards in Public Life than the new Code of Conduct completely. The reason is, as I've said, the code in Cornwall is very similar to a code across England. The provisions in it have been used in Cornwall all but since 2002. They're very well understood by perhaps the councillors that have been in the area for longer, in post for longer. And also because they match very closely the codes in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, there's still case law being generated by these codes. It is something that we can look at and help with the interpretation of it. So there are some changes recommended to the code, but very few. Statutory changes still have to be made to the code, and this will change what has to be registered. What will need to be registered in the future, but not at the moment, is unpaid directorships, trusteeships, management roles in charities or bodies of a public nature, and membership of any body set up to influence public opinion. That is what used to have to be registered pre-2011 and what will need to be registered in the future. And towns and parishes will be required to adopt the code of their principal authority. Now, with regards to this last point, one of the things the Standards Committee will be looking at in Cornwall Council and working with Calc and the Society of the Clerks is looking at creating a code of conduct across Cornwall that one size fits all. So when the statutory changes come in, everybody in Cornwall, all the bodies in Cornwall already have a good idea of what their code looks like. And there is no difference between the Cornwall Council Code and a Parish Council Code. Next slide, please. One of the things that's been recommended is that local authorities are to be given the power to suspend without allowances for up to 6 months. It used to be in a power that they had, but that was removed in 2011 with the Localism Act. Appeals against a suspension can be made then to the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman. They are looking at this. They've been kicking it backwards and forwards. I've been in a couple of meetings with them, with LGO, about they're looking at the grounds for the appeal. They're looking at what they will allow an appeal on, but there will be an appeals process of some sort. If there is an appeal made to the Ombudsman, the decision of the Ombudsman with regard to suspensions would be binding. Now, you might say, well, I thought they were. Well, actually, what Ombudsman decisions are recommendations to an authority. They are not binding on that authority. This will be different. These will be decisions that will be binding. Suspensions will only be imposed if the independent person agrees with both the finding of a breach of the code and the suspension. So the IP will then have to agree with this process. And it's most likely that this will receive a return of hearings. Some of you may remember that we used to have hearing panels. A member of a panel of 3 would hear a complaint to the Code of Conduct and decide whether a suspension should be imposed. It is most likely you will see this return. Next slide, please. One of the things the Localism Act removed was the ability for lay members and town and parish representatives on the Standards Committee to vote on matters, and it's intended this should be reintroduced. Some Standards Committees got rid completely of their lay members and town and parish representatives. Cornwall Council has retained them on the Standards Committee to ensure that town and parishes and the members of the public have a voice on the committee, but at the moment they do not have a vote. The criminal offence for failing to declare a disclosable pecuniary interest will be abolished. It will no longer be a criminal offence. It will then become a matter of a breach of the code and whether the suspension comes in place. The law will be amended to confirm that councils can lawfully bar its councillors from council premises. Something Cornwall Council has done, but it's supposed to be coming into statute. And the law will be clarified with regards to the ability of the principal authority to impose sanctions on a parish councillor. This stems from the rather woolly wording of Section 28 of the Localism Act, and it will make it clear that that power is there. And the requirement for councillors to put their home address on the public register of interest will be removed. At the moment, this is still a legal requirement, but this is something that will be removed in the future. Councillor Bassett, you have a question?
Thank you. Yes, just on suspensions, because if a councillor is suspended because of their behaviour or their conduct, and their allowances are not going to be paid, that seems like a personal punishment against the councillor, when actually that a councillor is elected by the people, and it's the people that miss out. It's the people they represent that miss out. So I'm a bit not sure as to how effective suspensions are.
I can, in terms of it, that's that's been the circular argument ever since the new code came in, and it's always been an argument that's been raised: is the people are elected, and therefore, you know, it should be the people that decides. In terms of it, we just had an election. If a councillor now does something really bad within their council, say they make a decision on their brother's planning application, this planning application is passed, it was their vote that carried it. Unless there is a legal challenge to that planning application route, that councillor at best will be censured only. There's nothing else that can be done. There are also councillors that are extremely disruptive in council meetings, and I'm talking now about not even 0.5% of the councillors in Cornwall. From 2009 to 2012, there was only 6 suspensions in Cornwall. But those 0.5% are so disruptive, and this is probably the same across England, because the majority of councillors want to see the reintroduction of suspensions to remove those people that are very, very disruptive. And that is where the argument becomes circular and the problem's created. We used to get 80 complaints a year before suspensions were removed. We had 192 complaints last year, and year on year, complaints continue to increase. There is no sanction against those that wish to breach the code. Suspensions will prevent those breaches of the code.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide, please. The Ministry of Housing and Communities and Local Governments is looking at these changes, and one of the things they've looked at is exactly what's just been raised. I'm on the Monitoring Officer Working Group. I'm fortunate enough to meet with the Ministry every quarter, and the issue about suspensions has been kicked around a lot. It is something they are now looking at to consider the key recommendations and how they can be introduced. There is a possible consultation on the statutory changes over the summer. We've been promised the consultation before. We were promised it last September, but unfortunately other events took over. If a consultation comes about, we will ensure that all clerks in Cornwall are made aware of the consultation on how to respond to it. I should imagine, but I can't be sure, that you will be able to respond as an authority, or you will be able to respond as individuals. Part of the changes will look at the bullying and the intimidation of councillors and officers at all levels of local government. And that's something the Standards Committee will be looking at with CALC and the Society of Clerks as well. So that's not just the bullying of councillors, it's the bullying of councillors by officers, officers by council, and then bullying by you, bullying by members of the public as well. Oh. I've had a question from Councillor Brown. Can I say something about issues surrounding informal communications in an attempt to construct a block vote on any issues prior to a meeting? Block voting, or whipping as it is more popularly called, does not create predetermination. The reason is that even if a block vote is created, it's considered that the decision makers still have free will and therefore can exercise it. If you get very bored and it rains a lot, which it's doing again down in Penzance, there are some great case law from the 80s surrounding Derek Hatton and political whipping. It's very, very interesting, but it's never considered to have created predetermination. Next slide, please. That concludes the training. Are there any questions, please? Just switching. I'll just wait for hands to show because it can take a little bit to come through my system and to show the wonders of modern technology. If you have, finally to close, if you have any questions about the Code of Conduct, please get in touch with me. Please try to ask the question before the event. Don't try to get hold of me at 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening when your meeting's at 7, as it's highly unlikely I'll be available. If you give us as much notice as you can, we will try to assist you. In fact, generally we'll always assist you before a meeting. We will always try to assist you to prevent a breach of the code. rather than deal with the matter after the breach has arisen. I've got somebody saying that Chris Doddle has raised his hand, but I haven't got a hand raised on my system down here. Chris, have you got a question?
Chris, do you want to unmute your mic?
I'll answer Pete's questions coming in the chat. How does a local member deal with a local issue to where he lives without breaching the code? Well, if you have no involvement with that local issue, then you wouldn't be in any breach of the code. If you know the people just because you live in the local area, it doesn't create close association with that person. If you're not a member of the group or body that deals with those local things, then you will not be in breach of the code. It's only if it is a disclosable pecuniary interest, or it directly affects a family member, a group or body, or somebody with whom you have close association, that the code comes into play. If it does comes into play, you can still write as a local member to your authority, but you cannot be a decision maker. Ross Y has asked what consists of bringing the council into disrepute. To bring the council into disrepute, the councillor concerned who was suspended had acted as a member of that council. They had set out and they'd written to Cormac, they'd written to Cornwall Council, and they'd written to other bodies, holding themselves out as acting as a member of that council, and the council had done nothing about it. Because of the way the member had acted, and because they'd held themselves out as being a member of the council, it wasn't challenged, they were then considered to have bringing their authority into disrepute. Councillor House said, sorry, I dropped out when you discussed para councillor access to Cornwall Council offices. Could you repeat? It's just, you should only use your access to authority to officers in Cornwall Council or your own authority for matters relating to your casework or to council matters. You should not use that access for personal matters. What is the correct forum for raising salary issues and budgets? That would be your council. It probably would be in closed session for salaries and budgets. Ultimately, salaries and budgets would then go into the public domain, but it would depend on, particularly on budgets, what you're discussing. Carol Newby, at the moment, what protections do the councillors and clerk have from residents who bully and intimidate through a newsletter? There's common law protection, but there is no protection in statute other than through common law. I would suggest the matter goes to the police. They are looking at changing the law with regards to this and bringing in an offence to intimidate an elected official, but they've been talking about this for 2 years and it's not come in yet. Councillor Vivian, do you wish to speak?
Yes, regarding suspension and council premises, does that include all council premises, including such things as leisure centres, libraries, even car parks that are owned by the council? Is it, or is it only the council offices?
It didn't include car parks in the case of the Cornwall Council, but it included all other premises because of the breach of the code. And I think it would probably be dependent on the breach as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Somebody's asked, does the code of conduct cover subcommittees? It covers all meetings of your council, and it covers, as I said, any time you're acting as a member of your authority or give the impression you are acting as a member of your authority. Councillor Hawkins has asked, do you register all attendees as confirmation? Yes, we do. And Councillor Emily, brackets guest, I presume that would be just a guest. What about a parish clerk who has an interest in a piece of land that is being discussed in a butts her home? Interesting question. If my advice would be, if I was an officer and I was in a meeting, and I have been in a meeting actually where something came up that I felt affected me, I would leave the meeting, and I know officers within Cornwall Council do the same. My advice would be that that officer, if they're affected by that decision, just for the clarity and transparency of the decision making, they should leave the meeting. Our subcommittees and non-council members bound by the Code of Conduct. All subcommittees, if members are co-opted onto your council, now you get co-optees on parish councils and they're considered classed then as treated as elected members, but you can bring people onto your subcommittees, as we have co-optees on our standards committee that are co-optees on that committee only. Yes, they are bound by the Code of Conduct. Councillor Brown has said there have been occasions of late where the police have detained members of the public participating in pre-arranged peaceful protests. If you are detained in this way when acting as a private individual, does this carry implications of disrepute? No, if you're there as a private individual, potentially if you are there acting as a councillor, but it would depend on the circumstances. Any more questions? Hey, there's another one. Is there a requirement to attend all meetings if you feel there are too many scheduled? I would discuss that with your clerk. Try to be as inclusive as possible. It's not a breach of the code if you do not attend a meeting. If you don't attend meetings for a period of 6 months, you will automatically be disqualified from being a councillor. But providing you attend within that 6 months, but I would speak to your clerk about how many meetings there are, because it is appreciated that you're volunteers and you'd have your own lives and your own time that you need to balance. Emily, did you say there's a new code to adopt now? No, you can adopt the one now if you wish. All the new code has been sent to the clerks by us, and Calc has also circulated this as well. Can you explain the term suspended? Would a councillor be able to take comment on council work under their personal hat? No, if you are suspended as a councillor, you are suspended as a councillor. You have to pass all your casework over to somebody else. You cannot do any casework whatsoever. You are removed from it. No more questions. Thank you everybody much for attending. I appreciate the questions. It's very much appreciated. Makes me think a little bit. We will be running more training over the summer months, probably a couple of evening sessions as we go forwards as well. Got to see about that. In terms of, we will also be returning to face-to-face training, hopefully in the autumn, and it will be great to see people because it's just not the same doing it like this. In the meantime, thank you very much, everybody. It's much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Many thanks, Simon.